Homeowners started paying for a secret problem. The night they came for my ranch, rain hammered Mercer Lake so hard I could barely see the shoreline. HOA President Diane Whitmore stood beside deputies and tow trucks, holding a court order over her head while telling my neighbors she was taking part of my 3,000-acre property. Most people thought the fight was over. What nobody knew was that her entire luxury subdivision depended on one thing she didn't legally own. I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I asked one question about an emergency road, and suddenly the sheriff looked nervous. That was the moment I realized Diane's biggest problem wasn't me. It was a file buried in county records that nobody expected a surveyor to find. And when that file finally surfaced, an entire HOA started coming apart one document at a time. If you enjoy stories about land rights, quiet determination, and ordinary people standing their ground through facts instead of fury, consider subscribing. And while you listen, let me know in the comments, if an HOA tried to claim part of your property, would you fight back or walk away? Rain hammered Mercer Lake hard enough to blur the far shoreline into a gray wall. The water churned under the wind, and red and blue lights flashed across the surface from two sheriff's SUVs parked outside my gate. 3 tow trucks sat idling behind them. I stood on the porch of my ranch house, watching the whole thing unfold. Then I saw Diane Whitmore step out of her white Range Rover. She wore a navy rain jacket with Silver Pines Estates stitched across the chest. 2 HOA board members followed behind her carrying clipboards under matching umbrellas. They looked less like neighbors and more like a crew arriving to repossess a business. The worst part wasn't the weather. It was the audience. Lights flicked on across the lake. People stepped onto covered decks and porches. Phones came out. Cameras started recording. Diane loved an audience. She marched straight through my gate, stopping in the middle of my driveway while rain soaked the gravel around her boots. In one hand, she held a thick folder. In the other was a court order. She raised it above her head. "By authority of Silver Pines Estates," she shouted, loud enough for every house along the shoreline to hear, "this property is now subject to immediate enforcement action." The words echoed across the water. One of the tow truck drivers shifted his weight and glanced toward the deputies. Even he looked uncomfortable. I walked down from the porch and stopped about 20 feet away. I didn't say anything. That seemed to bother Diane more than if I'd started yelling. She smiled. It was the same smile she'd worn for years whenever she thought she had somebody cornered. "Caleb Mercer has repeatedly refused to pay mandatory shoreline assessments," she announced to the crowd. "He has ignored HOA compliance notices, infrastructure fees, and community maintenance obligations." Several people across the lake nodded. Some of them actually believed her. That was the problem with confidence. People mistook it for truth. Diane pointed toward the ranch behind me. "As of tonight, Silver Pines Estates is exercising its legal right to seize affected property until outstanding obligations are resolved." Affected property. Interesting phrase. Not ranch, not land. Affected property. Lawyers chose words carefully. I looked toward the deputies. Sheriff Owen Briggs stood beside one of the SUVs with rain running down the brim of his hat. I'd known Owen for years, not socially, but long enough to recognize when something bothered him. And something definitely bothered him tonight. Diane noticed me looking past her. "No speech?" she asked. I kept my hands in my jacket pockets. "No threats?" Still nothing. The silence stretched. One of the board members shifted nervously. Finally, Diane stepped closer. "You should have settled this months ago." Rain drummed against the hood of her SUV. "You had every opportunity." I nodded once. Then I looked directly at Sheriff Briggs. "Question for you, Sheriff." Diane frowned. The sheriff looked up. "What is it, Caleb?" I pointed toward the subdivision across the lake. the glow of 62 homes reflected on the water. Did they reroute the emergency fire road already? Everything stopped. Not dramatically, just enough. The sheriff blinked. One deputy looked at the other. A board member lowered his clipboard slightly. It lasted maybe 2 seconds, but I saw it. So did Diane. "What does that have to do with anything?" she snapped. I ignored her. The sheriff cleared his throat. "We're not discussing that tonight." That answer told me everything I needed to know, because it wasn't a no. Diane jumped back in immediately. "Don't start with your legal games." Her voice rose. "The HOA owns the shoreline infrastructure now." Owns. That word hung in the air. I almost smiled. Almost. Because there was a big difference between maintaining something and owning it. A difference measured in deeds, surveys, and county records. The kind of difference that could bankrupt people. Diane turned toward the tow truck operators. "Go ahead." One of the drivers hesitated. The other looked toward the deputies again. Nobody moved. Not yet. The sheriff stepped forward. "Before anything happens, we need clarification regarding access boundaries." Diane's jaw tightened. "The court order is clear." "Maybe," Owen replied calmly. "But there are questions." For the first time all night, Diane's confidence cracked. Just a little. Just enough for me to see it. Because she hadn't expected questions. She'd expected surrender. The rain intensified. Water streamed down the driveway toward the lake. Across the shoreline, more residents gathered under covered patios. Watching. Waiting. Recording. Diane lowered her voice. "This is your last chance, Caleb." I looked past her toward Silver Pines Estates. The marina lights glowed in the distance. The roads, the drainage system, the utility corridors, the emergency route. Every piece connected like a puzzle. And somewhere inside that puzzle sat a mistake big enough to make a sheriff hesitate in the middle of a property seizure. I looked back at Diane, then at the court order in her hand, then at Sheriff Briggs. And finally I asked the question Diane clearly didn't want anyone asking. "Before you lock my gate tonight," I said, "who exactly owns the road your entire subdivision needs to escape a wildfire?" Nobody answered. Not Diane, not the board members, not even the sheriff. The only sound was rain striking the lake, and standing there in the storm, surrounded by deputies, tow trucks, and neighbors who thought they were watching the end of a rancher's fight, I realized something important. Diane Whitmore had come here convinced she held all the power. But the second I mentioned that road, she stopped looking like someone who was winning, and started looking like someone who was afraid. What I didn't know yet was why. To understand that, I have to take you back to where this started. Back before the tow trucks, before the court order, before Silver Pines Estates decided my lake belonged to them. Back to something my father left behind that nobody, not even Diane Whitmore, thought still mattered. My father, Thomas Mercer, never trusted promises. He trusted records, receipts, survey markers, deeds, the kind of paperwork most people throw away after a few years. When he died, he left me the ranch, the lake, and an old steel filing cabinet sitting in the corner of the workshop. Most people would have hauled it to the dump. My father would have considered that a crime. The cabinet weighed almost as much as a small tractor. Every drawer was packed with folders dating back decades. Land surveys, water permits, tax records, boundary agreements, handwritten notes. Nothing seemed organized except in the way only old ranchers understand. After my wife Claire passed away, I spent a lot of evenings in that workshop. Not because I enjoyed paperwork, because it kept me busy. Grief is easier to manage when your hands have something to do. Some people drink, some people disappear. I sorted files. One evening, about 3 years before Diane arrived at my gate with tow trucks, I was sitting beside a workbench reviewing old property maps. That's when I found a note clipped to one of my father's surveys. It wasn't important at the time. At least I didn't think it was. The note contained only one sentence. If developers ever reach the north shoreline, review access agreements immediately. No explanation, no details, just that. I remember laughing. The north shoreline was mostly empty back then. A few scattered parcels, some grazing land, nothing worth worrying about. I put the folder back into the cabinet and forgot about it. That turned out to be a mistake, because about a year later, trucks started appearing beyond the lake. First came the survey crews, then bulldozers, then construction trailers. Within months, hundreds of acres were being cleared. Trees disappeared, roads appeared, concrete foundations followed. Silver Pines Estates had arrived. At first, I didn't care. People build subdivisions all over Colorado. That's not a crime. The first time I met Diane Whitmore, she wasn't wearing an HOA jacket. She wasn't carrying violation notices. She wasn't threatening lawsuits. She was smiling. I was repairing a section of fence near the shoreline when a white Range Rover pulled onto the dirt road. Diane stepped out and walked toward me. Perfect boots, perfect hair, not a speck of dust anywhere, which was impressive considering she was standing in the middle of a ranch. "Beautiful property," she said. I thanked her. She looked across Mercer Lake. The water was calm that day. The shoreline stretched for nearly 2 miles. My family's shoreline. Diane studied it like she was already making plans. "This whole area is going to change," she said. I shrugged. "Probably." She smiled. "People are going to love having access to this lake." Something about the way she said access bothered me. Not enough to start an argument. Just enough to remember it later. Then she got back into her SUV and drove away. That should have been the end of it. Instead, it became the beginning. Construction accelerated. The subdivision grew fast. New homes appeared almost overnight. Families moved in. Then something strange started happening. People kept showing up on my property. Not aggressively, just confidently, like they believed they belonged there. One Saturday morning, I found 3 teenagers fishing from my dock. Another afternoon, a family launched kayaks from my shoreline. A week later, somebody tied a pontoon boat to one of my posts. Every time I approached them, the response was almost identical. "We thought this was community access," or "The HOA newsletter said residents could use the lake," or "They told us the shoreline was shared." Shared. That word started showing up everywhere. The problem was my deed never mentioned shared access. Neither did any survey I'd ever seen. One afternoon, curiosity finally got the better of me. I drove to Silver Pine's sales office. The place looked more like a luxury resort than a real estate center. Stone entrance, lake photographs, large development maps, smiling salespeople. I walked in pretending to be interested in buying a property. A young salesman greeted me immediately. He pointed toward a giant map mounted on the wall. "This is our waterfront district." My stomach tightened, because part of the highlighted waterfront district was my shoreline, my dock, my land. I kept my voice calm. "Who owns the lake access?" The salesman smiled. "The community controls recreational shoreline privileges." Controls, not owns. I noticed that immediately. The wording was careful, very careful. I took one of the brochures and left. Back at the ranch, I spread the brochure across my kitchen table. Then I pulled out one of my father's maps. The differences were impossible to ignore. The brochure showed community access reaching far beyond the subdivision boundaries. Straight onto Mercer Ranch, straight onto my shoreline. I looked toward the steel cabinet sitting in the workshop. Then I remembered my father's note. If developers ever reach the north shoreline, review access agreements immediately. For the first time, that sentence didn't sound paranoid. It sounded like a warning. I went back into the workshop and opened the cabinet. The drawer squealed on old rails. Folders sat stacked exactly where I'd left them years earlier. I started digging. Hours passed. Survey maps, old permits, tax documents. Then I found the folder, the one with my father's handwritten note. Inside was a faded reference sheet attached to a survey from decades ago. Across the top, written in blue ink, were 4 words: North Shore Access Agreement. My pulse quickened. I flipped through the pages. The document wasn't complete. Half the paperwork was missing. But one thing was obvious. At some point in the past, somebody had negotiated access rights involving land near Mercer Lake. And whatever those rights were, my father had considered them important enough to preserve. I stared at the folder for a long time. Outside, the lights of Silver Pines Estates reflected across the water. Construction continued. Homes kept selling. Residents kept arriving. And suddenly, I found myself wondering a question I couldn't answer. What exactly had my father been trying to warn me about? Because if Silver Pines was already advertising shoreline access that didn't belong to them, then maybe Diane Whitmore's plans for the lake had started long before anyone noticed. And somewhere inside that incomplete file might be the reason. At the time, I didn't have enough information to prove anything. What I had was suspicion. And suspicion doesn't hold up in court. Evidence does. So I started paying attention. The more I watched Silver Pines Estates, the stranger things became. Every month the subdivision grew. New homes appeared along the hillside. More residents arrived, and somehow more of them ended up on my property. One Saturday morning I found 2 paddleboards tied to my dock. The next week a family was setting up folding chairs near my shoreline. Then came the boats. Small fishing boats at first. Then pontoon boats. Every conversation followed the same pattern. People weren't trying to trespass. They genuinely believed they belonged there. One homeowner even showed me a welcome packet from Silver Pines. Inside was a map, a very familiar map. My shoreline was highlighted in blue. The label beneath it read, Community Waterfront Recreation Zone. I stared at it for several seconds. The homeowner noticed my expression. That's what they gave us when we bought the house. I folded the brochure carefully. Who gave you this? The HOA. Of course they did. That evening I spread the brochure across my kitchen table beside one of my father's surveys. The difference wasn't subtle. The HOA map treated Mercer Lake like a community asset. The legal survey treated it like private property. Because it was. The next morning I drove into Silver Pines, not as a ranch owner, as an observer. The subdivision clubhouse overlooked the lake from a hillside ridge. Luxury stone entrance, landscaped walkways, large banners advertising future amenities. One banner immediately caught my attention. Private marina coming soon, another read. Expanded waterfront access. I kept walking. Near the sales center, a giant display board showed the planned expansion. My stomach tightened. The proposed marina stretched directly into an area bordering my shoreline. Not close to it. Into it. I stepped inside. A sales representative greeted me. Young guy. Perfect smile. Expensive watch. He pointed proudly toward the display. Our waterfront development is one of the biggest attractions. I nodded. Who owns the marina property? The association controls the waterfront district. Again. Controls, not owns. Nobody wanted to use that word. Because ownership requires paperwork. Control is just a claim. I left with another brochure. This one was even worse. The promotional images showed residents fishing from docks that didn't exist yet. Docks positioned exactly where my family had owned shoreline rights for decades. That afternoon, I drove home and started taking photographs. Every sign, every advertisement, every brochure, every map. My father always said documentation beats arguments, so I documented everything. A week later, Diane Whitmore held a community event beside the lake. Food trucks, live music, real estate presentations. The whole thing looked more like a resort launch than an HOA gathering. I parked near the back and watched. Nobody paid much attention to me. That changed when Diane stepped onto a temporary stage overlooking the water. She spent 20 minutes talking about growth, property values, future investments. Then she pointed toward the lake. Our residents deserve full access to the shoreline resources surrounding Silver Pines estates. Applause followed. Then came the sentence that changed everything. The association maintains authority over community-controlled waterfront territory. Authority. Community-controlled. Territory. Not one of those words appeared on any deed I'd ever seen. I noticed several residents nodding along. They believed her. Why wouldn't they? She sounded confident. Confident people rarely get challenged. That's how bad information spreads. After the presentation ended, I approached the stage. Diane spotted me immediately. Her smile tightened. Caleb? Diane? She folded her arms. You enjoy the presentation? I noticed something interesting. Her expression didn't change. What's that? I held up one of the brochures. The waterfront district seems to extend beyond your property. For a split second, something flashed across her face. Not fear. Not yet. Annoyance. Then the smile returned. The community benefits from shared shoreline resources. There it is again. What? Shared. Her jaw tightened slightly. I continued. My deed doesn't mention shared access. The community has certain rights. Recorded where? The smile vanished, only for a moment. But it vanished. Then she recovered. Talk to the HOA attorney if you have concerns. Interesting answer. Because she didn't actually answer the question. I watched her walk away. And for the first time, I became convinced of something. Diane wasn't confused. She wasn't mistaken. She was deliberately using language that sounded legal without actually being legal. That realization changed the entire situation. Because misunderstandings can be corrected. Intentional misrepresentations are different. Those create liability. A few days later, I discovered just how far she was willing to go. Driving home one afternoon, I noticed a new sign installed near my northern fence line. Large, metal, impossible to miss. Private community shoreline authorized access only. The sign wasn't beside my property. It was on my property, bolted directly into one of my fence posts, one of my father's fence posts. I parked the truck and stared at it. Then I took photographs. Lots of photographs, from every angle. Because anger wouldn't help me. Evidence would. While I was documenting the sign, a golf cart rolled up. Diane was driving. She looked at the sign proudly. As you can see, we're improving shoreline management. I looked from the sign to her. You nailed that into my fence. The community needed clear boundaries. That's not your boundary. She smiled again. The same smile she'd wear months later during the seizure attempt. The smile of someone convinced nobody can stop them. We'll let the paperwork determine that. Then she drove away, leaving me standing beside a sign that claimed ownership over land she didn't own. I watched her disappear toward the subdivision, and suddenly the incomplete file from my father's cabinet felt far more important, because if Diane Whitmore was willing to publicly claim authority over my shoreline, Then he was building towards something bigger. The only question was how far she planned to go before someone forced her to prove it. I got my answer 3 weeks later. The sound woke me up before sunrise. Metal striking dirt. Again, and again, and again. I stepped onto the porch with a cup of coffee and immediately saw what was happening. Contractors, 4 of them, working along the northern shoreline, steel posts, concrete anchors, rolls of black fencing. My stomach dropped. The fence wasn't near the property line. It was well inside it. I grabbed my truck keys and headed down the access road. By the time I reached them, nearly 50 feet of fencing was already standing. The crew foreman looked uncomfortable the second he saw me. "Morning," I said. Nobody answered. I pointed at the steel posts. "Who told you this was your property?" The foreman held up a clipboard. "We were hired by Silver Pines Estates." That wasn't an answer. I stepped closer. "Who told you this land belongs to Silver Pines?" The man hesitated, then handed me a site map. The moment I unfolded it, I knew something was wrong. The boundary line had been moved, not by a little, by nearly 40 feet. Enough to absorb part of my shoreline, enough to capture access to a section of the lake, enough to make future marina expansion possible. I looked up. "Who approved this survey?" The foreman shook his head. "Sir, we just build what's on the plans." Of course they did. 10 minutes later, a familiar white Range Rover appeared. Diane Whitmore stepped out. Perfectly composed, perfectly confident, like she expected me to thank her for fencing my own property. She walked toward the shoreline carrying a large envelope. "Caleb?" "Diane." She glanced toward the contractors. "Everything moving smoothly?" "Not really." I held up the map. "This fence is on my land." "No," she said calmly. "It's on community property." "According to who?" "The association's survey." I almost laughed, because that wasn't how ownership worked. You don't create property rights by printing a different map. But Diane acted as if she did. She handed me the envelope. Certified mail. Official. Heavy. The kind of envelope designed to scare people before they even open it. I unfolded the documents. My eyes stopped on the total. $47,600. According to Silver Pines Estates, I now owed shoreline maintenance fees, community infrastructure assessments, lake preservation charges, access improvement costs. There were even penalties for refusing to cooperate with HOA enforcement actions. I read the list twice, then looked back at Diane. "You're billing me for my own property." Her smile never moved. "You're benefiting from community improvements." I folded the papers. "Interesting theory." Her expression hardened slightly. "Failure to pay may result in liens and further legal action." There it was. The first real threat. Not brochures, not signs, not marketing language. Actual legal pressure. The contractors continued installing fencing behind us. Steel posts disappeared into dirt my family had owned for decades. Diane watched them work. She looked pleased. That told me something important. She believed the paperwork would protect her. People only act this boldly when they think the documents are on their side. That afternoon, things got worse. A county inspector arrived. His name was Kyle Jensen. Young, professional, clearly uncomfortable. He reviewed the HOA survey, then reviewed the fence line, then reviewed the permits. Finally, he looked at me. "Everything submitted appears valid." Appears. Interesting word. Not confirmed, not verified. Appears. I pointed toward the shoreline. "Did anyone compare this survey to the original parcel records?" Kyle paused, just for a second, then answered carefully. The approved development maps support the submitted boundaries. That wasn't the same thing, and we both knew it. But he wasn't willing to go further. Not yet. By sunset, the fence stretched across nearly 200 feet of shoreline. Residents walked past it, smiling. Some even took photographs. One woman pointed at the lake and told her kids, "Now we finally have our waterfront." My waterfront. The part nobody seemed interested in discussing. That night I spread everything across my kitchen table. The HOA survey, the assessment notice, the contractor map, the county filings. Then I pulled out one of my father's original surveys. Hours passed. Coffee got cold. The house grew quiet. Outside, lights from silver pines reflected across Mercer Lake. Inside, I kept comparing numbers, line after line, coordinate after coordinate. Eventually, something caught my attention. A parcel reference. Tiny, almost invisible. One sequence of numbers on the HOA filing didn't match the county parcel designation shown on my father's survey. I checked again. Still wrong. I opened another map. Wrong again. Then a third. Same discrepancy. Not huge, just a few digits. Easy to overlook. Easy for most people. Not for someone staring at property records for half the night. I sat back slowly. Because land disputes don't happen because of giant mistakes. They happen because of small ones. One wrong coordinate, one incorrect survey marker, one altered parcel line, and suddenly millions of dollars are standing in the wrong place. I looked toward the fence outside, then toward the assessment notice, then toward the incomplete access file my father had left behind. For the first time, those pieces started connecting. The fence, the shoreline, the marina plans, the access agreement, the altered coordinates. This wasn't random, and it definitely wasn't a misunderstanding. Somebody had changed something. The only question was whether it was incompetence or intent. I picked up the survey again, studied the parcel number, then compared it to the county record one more time. The difference was still there. Small, precise, potentially catastrophic. And if those numbers were wrong, then the fence wasn't the biggest problem Diane Whitmore had. It was just the first visible symptom. Because suddenly I wasn't wondering whether Silver Pines was crossing onto my land. I was wondering how much of Silver Pines had been built on the wrong property in the first place. The next morning I drove straight to the county records office. I carried 3 things with me: my father's original survey, the HOA filing, and a growing suspicion that somebody had been relying on nobody checking the math. County offices aren't dramatic places. Nobody runs through hallways. Nobody slams doors. The damage happens quietly. One document at a time. Martin was behind the records counter when I arrived. Late 60s, reading glasses. The kind of man who knew where every file in the building lived. I spread the maps across the counter. I need another set of eyes. Martin adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. For nearly 20 minutes, he said almost nothing. Just compared documents. Clicked through parcel records. Zoomed in on county maps. Cross-checked numbers. Then he stopped. His eyebrows rose. That's strange. Those 2 words immediately got my attention. What is? Martin rotated the screen toward me. The county parcel map filled the monitor. My ranch sat on one side. Silver Pines Estates sat on the other. At least it was supposed to. Martin tapped the screen. This parcel reference doesn't match the original filing. I felt my pulse quicken. That's what I found. He clicked through another layer, then another. Suddenly, several infrastructure lines appeared. Road easements, utility routes, drainage corridors. Martin stared at them, then looked back at me. They've been filing updates for years. So some of those updates don't align with the original subdivision boundary. I stared at the screen. How much doesn't align? Martin exhaled slowly. More than I'd be comfortable seeing. That wasn't a legal opinion. It didn't need to be. It was enough. I left the records office with copies of everything Martin could legally provide. And for the first time, I wasn't just looking at a property dispute. I was looking at a pattern. A pattern big enough to explain why Diane Whitmore was acting increasingly desperate. The answer arrived sooner than I expected. 3 days later, at a gas station, a retired homeowner named Frank Tillman stopped me beside the pumps. Frank lived in Silver Pines. Good man. Former Army mechanic. Never had much interest in HOA politics. He looked worried. Got a minute? Sure. He handed me a letter. The number printed at the bottom jumped off the page. $8,400. What is this? Emergency Infrastructure Assessment. I read the notice, then read it again. The wording was vague. Infrastructure corrections, compliance improvements, community preservation expenses, not a single specific explanation. When did this arrive? Yesterday. You ask what it's for? Frank laughed without humor. They just said county requirements changed. That phrase stuck with me. County requirements changed. Because nobody at the county had mentioned anything changing. Not Martin, not the records office, nobody. Frank shook his head. People are angry. How angry? Depends how much they owe. That answer turned out to be accurate. Within 2 weeks, more residents received similar notices. $6,000, $9,000, $12,000. The numbers kept climbing, and the explanations kept shrinking. Meanwhile, Diane accelerated every project around the lake. More shoreline construction, more marina planning, more signs, more claims. It was like watching somebody sprint while carrying a secret. The harder she pushed, the more obvious it became that she needed money. Fast. A week later, I found another clue. This one came directly from Silver Pines. The HOA held an emergency community meeting at the clubhouse. I wasn't invited. That didn't stop me from parking across the street. Residents packed the lot. Dozens of them. The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours. When people finally started leaving, the mood was ugly. Nobody looked reassured. One couple argued beside their SUV. Another homeowner stormed out carrying paperwork. Then Frank appeared. He spotted me immediately. She's asking for more. How much? He held up another letter. $15,000. I stared at him. For what? Legal compliance updates. There it was again. Compliance, corrections, infrastructure. The same words, repeated over and over, like someone was trying to solve a problem with money. The question was, what problem? That answer arrived unexpectedly. 2 days later, a woman named Melissa Carter showed up at my ranch. Mid-30s, new homeowner, nervous, determined. She carried a thick folder under one arm. You Caleb Mercer? Depends who's asking? She almost smiled, then handed me the folder. I think the HOA lied to us. That got my attention. Inside were marketing materials from Silver Pines, property disclosures, mortgage paperwork, promotional maps, lake access guarantees, marina plans, emergency route diagrams. I flipped through them slowly, then stopped. One phrase appeared repeatedly. Permanent waterfront access. Guaranteed. I looked up. Your lender got these? Melissa nodded. They were part of our purchase package. That wasn't good. Because guarantees create expectations. Expectations create liability, and liability creates panic, especially when somebody knows the guarantees might not be true. Melissa lowered her voice. People are starting to ask questions. About what? The money. I nodded. Anything else? She hesitated, then answered. About who actually owns the shoreline. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Across the lake, the marina construction site sat quiet. Temporary fencing stretched along sections of the shore. The same fencing Diane insisted belonged there. The same fencing built from paperwork that no longer made sense. Melissa looked toward the water. Do you think they know? I already knew who she meant. The board, Diane, the developers, the people collecting the money. I thought about Martin's maps, the mismatched coordinates, the emergency assessments, the sudden urgency. Then I looked back at Melissa. I think somebody knows something. The real question wasn't whether there was a problem anymore. The real question was how big it was, because every new document pointed toward the same conclusion. Silver Pines wasn't raising money for improvements. They were raising money because something underneath the entire development was starting to crack. And if I was right, the next place to look wasn't the shoreline. It was the roads, the pipes, the infrastructure nobody ever notices until it stops working. Because sometimes a lake tells you where the trouble starts, but the roads tell you where it ends. The morning after Melissa Carter left the ranch, I stopped looking at shoreline maps. I started looking at infrastructure, roads, utility corridors, drainage systems, the things nobody notices until they're gone. The first clue came from the same incomplete file my father had left behind. Buried among old surveys was a faded reference to something called the North Access Corridor. No map attached. No detailed explanation. Just a notation referencing emergency use access. The phrase bothered me, because Silver Pines had only one secondary evacuation route, and I knew exactly where it ran. Straight through Mercer Ranch. That afternoon I drove the route myself. The road wound through a section of my property before climbing toward the subdivision. Nothing unusual about it. I'd used that road for years. What mattered wasn't the road itself. It was who depended on it. Near sunset, I made a phone call. Not to a lawyer, not yet. To the county fire department. 2 days later, Fire Marshal Ray Thompson pulled into the ranch in a dusty county pickup. Ray wasn't a politician. He wasn't an HOA board member. He wasn't interested in property disputes. He cared about one thing: emergency access. We drove out to the road together. Ray studied the gate, then the route, then the subdivision beyond the ridge. Finally, he frowned. Hold on. I recognized that tone immediately. It was the same tone Martin used when something didn't make sense. What is it? Ray pointed toward the road. Silver Pines uses this as their wildfire evacuation route. I know. His frown deepened. This gate is private? Always has been. Ray looked surprised. There's no county-controlled access? No. No permanent easement. Not that I've found. For several seconds he didn't say anything. He simply stared down the road, then toward the subdivision, then back at me. I assumed they had one. Assumed. That word kept appearing. Martin assumed. The county inspector assumed. Residents assumed. Everyone assumed somebody else had verified everything. Nobody seemed interested in proving it. Ray asked to see the records. I showed him what I had. The original surveys, the incomplete access file, the property boundaries, the temporary references. Nothing showing permanent emergency access. Nothing. By the time he finished reviewing them, his expression had changed. This could become a serious issue. That was probably the understatement of the year, because Silver Pines wasn't a small subdivision anymore. Dozens of families lived there. In wildfire country, if emergency compliance failed, The consequences would be enormous. Insurance companies cared about that. Mortgage lenders cared about that. County regulators definitely cared about that. As Ray drove away, one thing became clear. The road mattered, a lot, but it wasn't the only thing crossing my property. Over the next week, I started tracing infrastructure, one document at a time. The results were worse than I expected. Drainage pipes serving part of Silver Pines crossed ranch land. Utility trenches appeared to run through parcels connected to Mercer Ranch boundaries. Maintenance access routes cut across sections of my property. Then came the marina. The planned marina expansion required service access from a road that wasn't fully inside HOA property. I spread everything across the kitchen table. Maps, surveys, infrastructure diagrams. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Silver Pines wasn't just touching Mercer Ranch. It depended on Mercer Ranch. The realization hit hard, because it changed the scale of the conflict. This was no longer about a fence, or a dock, or even the shoreline. This was about whether an entire luxury subdivision had secured the legal rights it needed to function. And judging by what I was seeing, the answer wasn't looking good. Meanwhile, Diane Whitmore kept escalating. More newsletters, more assessments, more claims of authority. Every week, another announcement appeared. New infrastructure projects, compliance upgrades, community improvements. The language never changed. The urgency kept growing. Then Frank Tillman called me. His voice sounded tense. "You need to hear this." "What happened?" "The HOA board met again. And they approved another round of assessments." I closed my eyes. "How much this time?" "Depends on the house." That wasn't the answer I wanted. Frank continued. "Some people got hit for $10,000. I sat back in my chair. Did Diane explain why? Same story. Infrastructure corrections, legal compliance, necessary upgrades. The same phrases again. The same panic hidden behind different paperwork. After we hung up, I looked out across Mercer Lake. Lights reflected from Silver Pines. Families ate dinner. Kids rode bikes. People walked dogs along sidewalks. Most of them had no idea what was happening underneath the neighborhood. They thought this was a dispute between a ranch owner and an HOA president. It wasn't, not anymore. The deeper I dug, the more obvious it became that Diane Whitmore wasn't fighting for control of the shoreline. She was fighting to keep something much larger from being discovered. The question was what? And that's when I decided I needed someone who specialized in boundaries. Someone who didn't care about HOA politics. Someone who cared only about facts. Surveyors. A week later, I made a call to one of the most respected land surveyors in Colorado. His name was Russell Kane. Gray beard, 40 years of experience. The kind of man who trusted steel survey pins more than people. I explained the situation. The fence, the shoreline, the access road, the mismatched parcel numbers. Russell listened quietly. When I finished, there was a long pause. Then he asked one question. "Do you still have the original surveys?" "Every one of them." "Good." Another pause. Then he said something that stayed with me. "Because if the records are telling the truth, somebody's going to have a very bad year." And for the first time since this started, I felt the balance of power beginning to move. Not because we had answers, because we were finally asking the right questions. The kind of questions that only become dangerous when someone starts digging through old files nobody thought mattered anymore. Russell Kane arrived at Mercer Ranch on a Monday morning. He drove an aging pickup covered in dust and survey equipment. No fancy logo, no polished presentation. Just decades of experience and a reputation for being painfully thorough. The first thing he asked for wasn't coffee. It wasn't a tour of the property. It was paperwork. For 2 days, my kitchen table disappeared beneath maps, original surveys, county plats, development filings, property transfers, infrastructure diagrams. Russell reviewed everything without rushing. The more he read, the less he talked. That wasn't encouraging. On the 3rd day, he walked the shoreline. On the 4th day, he inspected the access road. On the 5th day, he started requesting archived county records. That got my attention, because surveyors don't usually need records from decades ago unless something is seriously wrong. Late Friday afternoon, he called me. "Meet me at the county archives." His tone gave away nothing. When I arrived, Russell was sitting at a table surrounded by old file boxes. The county clerk had cleared an entire section for him. Folders covered every surface. Most dated back more than 10 years. Russell slid a document toward me. "Recognize this?" I looked down. Construction access permit. Silver Pines Development Corporation. Expiration date, 11 years earlier. I frowned. What am I looking at? The road. I read further. The permit granted temporary access across a section of Mercer Ranch during early subdivision construction. Temporary, not permanent, not renewable. Temporary. I looked up. "Where's the permanent easement?" Russell leaned back in his chair. "That's exactly the problem." The room suddenly felt very quiet. He opened another folder, then another, and another. Every file told the same story. Construction approval, temporary utility access, temporary maintenance corridor, temporary heavy equipment route, all temporary. Every single one. I stared at the stack. Maybe the permanent agreements are somewhere else. Russell shook his head. I thought so too. He reached into a final box, then removed a thin file. Old, worn, nearly forgotten. The kind of file nobody opens unless they're looking for something specific. "This is what I've been searching for." He handed it to me. The label read, North Shore Infrastructure Review. Inside were documents most people would never understand. Survey overlays, boundary references, permit histories, engineering notes. Then I saw it. A map. A very detailed map. The original subdivision overlay. Russell pointed toward the shoreline. "Look here." My eyes followed his finger. The marina. Part of it crossed Mercer Ranch land. Not planned future expansion. Existing infrastructure. Already built. I stared at the map, then looked farther north. The retaining wall. Same problem. Then the utility trench. Same problem. Then the emergency access road. Worse, much worse. The road wasn't partially dependent on Mercer Ranch. It was entirely dependent on Mercer Ranch. Without that route, nearly half of Silver Pines lost compliant emergency access. I slowly set the file down. "You're sure?" Russell's answer came immediately. "I've never been more sure of anything." For several moments, neither of us spoke, because suddenly the entire situation looked different. Diane Whitmore wasn't fighting over a fence. She wasn't fighting over a dock. She wasn't even fighting over the shoreline. She was fighting for control of infrastructure her HOA apparently never secured legally. Russell continued turning pages. The bad news wasn't finished. Several infrastructure systems appeared to rely on permits that expired years ago. Others depended on rights that were never permanently recorded. And some seemed to exist only because nobody had challenged them. Until now. I thought about the assessments, the emergency fees, the compliance notices, the sudden urgency. Everything started making sense. Diane wasn't collecting money because things were going well. She was collecting money because something underneath Silver Pines was starting to fail. Then Russell found the page that changed everything. a handwritten review summary attached to the original development records. One sentence had been highlighted decades earlier. Permanent access agreements required prior to infrastructure transfer. Required. Not optional. Required. I looked at Russell. Did they ever happen? He already knew the answer. No. The word landed like a hammer. No. No recorded transfer. No permanent access grant. No completed easement package. Nothing. 11 years had passed. Millions of dollars had been invested. Dozens of homes had been sold. And somehow, the most important legal step never appeared in the record. I leaned back slowly. How does nobody notice this? Russell gave a tired laugh. Oh, somebody probably noticed. That answer bothered me more than anything else. Because mistakes happen. Oversights happen. But this felt different. Too many documents referenced the problem. Too many warnings existed. Too many temporary approvals were extended through assumption rather than law. Eventually, Russell closed the file, then looked directly at me. Caleb, I already knew I wasn't going to like what came next. If these records are accurate, Silver Pines isn't operating on ownership. I waited. It's operating on hope. The room went silent. Because hope isn't a legal right. Hope doesn't survive court. Hope doesn't survive county review. And hope definitely doesn't survive a surveyor with 40 years of experience and access to forgotten records. For the first time since this began, I wasn't wondering whether Diane Whitmore knew about the problem. I was wondering how long she'd been trying to hide it. Because now we had something far more dangerous than suspicion. We had a file. A single forgotten file capable of unraveling everything Silver Pines claimed to own. And the next place those records were headed wasn't another archive box. It was a county hearing room. The notice went out 2 weeks later. Official county review. Infrastructure compliance hearing. Silver Pines Estates. Attendance requested. The wording sounded harmless. The reaction wasn't. By the time the hearing date arrived, rumors had spread through the subdivision. Residents whispered about easements, developers, missing records, insurance problems. Nobody knew exactly what was happening. They only knew something was wrong. The county administration building was packed before the meeting even started. Residents filled every available seat. Reporters showed up. Contractors showed up. County officials lined the front tables. Even Sheriff Owen Briggs was there. That got my attention. Because sheriffs don't attend infrastructure hearings unless the situation is becoming serious. I sat beside Marla Bennett, the attorney Russell had recommended after finding the file. Marla wasn't dramatic. She didn't make speeches. She didn't posture. She simply understood property law better than almost anyone in the county. In front of her sat 3 thick binders. Inside were the surveys, the permits, the filings, and Russell Kane's forgotten file. Across the room, Diane Whitmore entered with 2 attorneys. Expensive suits, expensive briefcases, expensive confidence. At least that's what they projected. But confidence is harder to fake when facts are involved. I noticed something immediately. Diane wasn't smiling as much as usual. Small detail. Important detail. The county commissioner called the hearing to order, then invited Silver Pines to present first. Of course, they wanted to speak first. People like Diane always do. For nearly 20 minutes, she walked through slides and presentations. Infrastructure projects, community investments, lake improvements, property enhancements. Every sentence sounded polished. Every explanation sounded reasonable. If I hadn't spent months digging through records, I might have believed her myself. Then she made a mistake, a big one. She pointed directly toward me. Mr. Mercer has repeatedly interfered with lawful community operations and infrastructure management. Several residents turned toward me. Diane continued. The association has exercised authority over these areas for years. Authority. Again. Not ownership. Authority. Marla made a note. Then another. Then another. I knew exactly what she was doing. Every public statement mattered now. Every claim. Every word. Because words become evidence when they're attached to official proceedings. Then the county commissioner called Fire Marshal Ray Thompson. The room grew noticeably quieter. Ray wasn't there to discuss HOA politics. He was there because emergency access affects public safety, and public safety gets people's attention. Ray walked to the front carrying several maps. Then he connected one to the projector. The emergency evacuation routes appeared on the screen. A red line cut through Silver Pines, then crossed directly onto Mercer Ranch. Ray pointed at it. This route serves as the subdivision's secondary wildfire evacuation corridor. Nobody reacted yet. Most residents already knew that. Then Ray continued. At this time, our review has not located a recorded permanent easement authorizing that access. The room froze. Not completely, just enough. Whispers started immediately. People leaned toward each other. Several homeowners exchanged confused looks. Diane stood up quickly. Those records are still being reviewed. Interesting answer, not the easement exists, not here it is, just still being reviewed. Ray wasn't finished. He clicked to another map. Drainage infrastructure. Then another. Utility corridors. Then another. Marina service access. One by one they appeared on the screen. One by one they crossed areas connected to Mercer Ranch property. The whispers became louder. A woman in the back shook her head. A man near the aisle pulled out his phone. The room felt different now. Less like a hearing. More like a realization. Then the commissioner turned toward Marla. Counselor? Marla stood. No theatrics. No raised voice. She simply walked to the projector, then handed Russell's file to county staff. The first overlay appeared. Original property boundaries. The second overlay followed. Modern infrastructure. The difference was impossible to miss. Roads crossed parcels they shouldn't. Utility routes touched land they didn't own. The marina footprint extended beyond authorized boundaries. Each slide made the room quieter, not louder, quieter. Because shock isn't always noisy. Sometimes it sounds like silence. Marla pointed toward one highlighted section. This infrastructure was originally authorized through temporary construction access. Another slide. These permits expired more than a decade ago. Another slide. No permanent replacement has been located. Then she stopped. The room remained silent. Nobody wanted to interrupt, because everybody could see where this was heading. Finally, Marla displayed the most important page, the one Russell had found. Permanent access agreements required prior to infrastructure transfer. The sentence filled the screen, large enough for everyone to read, large enough for nobody to misunderstand. Marla stepped aside, then calmly asked a single question. Can Silver Pines produce the recorded permanent agreements referenced here? The room turned toward Diane, toward her attorneys, toward the front table, waiting. One attorney shuffled papers. The other whispered something. Neither answered. The commissioner waited. Still nothing. For the first time since this started, Diane Whitmore looked genuinely uncomfortable. Not angry, not confident. Uncomfortable. Because the conversation had finally moved away from opinions and landed on records. The kind of records that don't care who sounds convincing. The commissioner leaned forward. Mrs. Whitmore, can your association provide those documents? The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds. but it felt much longer. And in that silence, everyone in the room understood the same thing. The file Russell Kane found wasn't a technicality. It was a problem, a very expensive problem. And the hardest question hadn't even been asked yet. Because if the easements didn't exist, then somebody needed to explain why homeowners had been paying for infrastructure the HOA never legally controlled. The answer never came. Not that day. Not from Diane Whitmore. Not from either of her attorneys. The county commissioner repeated the question. Can the association produce the permanent easement agreements? One attorney flipped through a binder. The other whispered to Diane. Pages turned. Folders opened. Nothing appeared. The silence spread through the room, and then the residents started talking. At first it was only whispers, then questions, then accusations. A man near the front stood up. You told us all this was permanent. A woman behind him raised a stack of assessment notices. What exactly did we pay for? The commissioner immediately called for order. It didn't help much, because something had changed. For years, Diane had controlled the conversation. She controlled the newsletters, the meetings, the explanations. Now she was losing control of the room, and everybody could see it. The county staff continued reviewing Russell's file. One of the commissioners leaned toward the fire marshal. Another compared maps with the county engineer. The deeper they looked, the worse things became. Ray Thompson returned to the podium. His expression was far more serious than before. Our department has completed a preliminary review of the emergency evacuation routes. The room quieted again. Nobody wanted to miss this. Ray pointed to the projected map. The secondary wildfire route serving approximately half of Silver Pines Estates crosses Mercer Ranch property. Everyone already knew that part. Then came the important part. At this time, we have located no recorded permanent access easement supporting that route. The room erupted. Not loudly. Worse. The kind of reaction that happens when hundreds of thousands of dollars suddenly feel uncertain. People looked at one another. Some pulled out phones. Others began searching through paperwork they'd brought with them. Then a voice came from the back. What happens if access isn't legal? Ray didn't hesitate. The county would be required to review emergency compliance. That answer hit hard, because everyone understood what it meant. Insurance, financing, property values, everything depended on compliance. The commissioner quickly stepped in. No action is being taken against homeowners at this time. That helped. A little. But it didn't answer the larger question. Why had nobody discovered this sooner? Marla Bennett stood again. Calm as ever. She walked toward the projector and displayed another series of documents. This time they weren't surveys. They were HOA records, assessment notices, board communications, financial summaries. Several had been provided by residents like Frank Tillman and Melissa Carter. Marla pointed toward a section highlighted in yellow. These emergency infrastructure assessments began approximately 6 months ago. Another slide appeared. Additional fees, compliance charges, special infrastructure collections. The dates lined up perfectly. Then came the document that changed everything. A board memorandum. Internal, not public. Obtained during the county review. The room fell silent as Marla enlarged a single paragraph. Infrastructure access documentation requires immediate review due to unresolved easement concerns. Date: 8 months earlier. 8 months. I looked toward Diane. She stopped making eye contact with anyone. Marla let the room absorb the information, then displayed another memo, then another. Each referenced the same issue: access concerns, infrastructure exposure, easement review, risk assessment. Different wording. Same problem. The timeline became impossible to ignore. The HOA wasn't discovering these issues now. They had been discussing them privately for months, maybe longer. A homeowner stood up. Frank Tillman. His voice echoed across the room. "You knew?" Nobody answered. Frank held up one of his assessment letters. "You charged us thousands of dollars because of this." Still no answer. The second attorney whispered urgently to Diane. She stared straight ahead. Then Melissa Carter stood. Her voice shook slightly. "Our mortgage package guaranteed permanent waterfront access." Several heads turned immediately. Melissa wasn't finished. "We bought our house based on those documents." Now people were talking everywhere. Questions, concerns, anger, fear. The commissioner struck the gavel repeatedly. Order slowly returned, but the damage was done. The room no longer viewed this as a paperwork dispute. They viewed it as a trust problem, and trust problems are much harder to fix. Finally, Diane stood. For a moment it looked like she might explain everything. Maybe she would deny it. Maybe blame the developer. Maybe blame the county. Instead, she chose a different strategy. "This association has always acted in the best interests of the community." The statement landed badly, because nobody had asked about intentions. They asked about records, ownership, easements, assessments, facts. The commissioner interrupted her. "Mrs. Whitmore, were HOA assessments collected while the association was aware of unresolved access concerns?" That was the question. The question nobody could answer, or perhaps didn't want to answer. Diane looked toward her attorneys. Neither spoke. She looked toward the commissioners, then toward the residents, then finally down at the table. No answer came, and that silence became the loudest moment of the entire hearing. Because silence can mean many things, but in that room, everyone interpreted it the same way. The homeowners weren't angry because mistakes happened. They were angry because somebody knew, or at least suspected, and kept collecting money anyway. The commissioner announced a formal county investigation before adjourning the hearing. Additional document reviews, financial audits, infrastructure verification. The process would take weeks, maybe months. People slowly began leaving. Nobody looked relieved, but many looked different. The fear was gone. Now they wanted answers. Outside the building, reporters gathered near the parking lot. Residents stood in small groups discussing what they'd learned. Frank walked past Diane without saying a word. Melissa ignored her completely. Even some HOA board members kept their distance. The balance of power had shifted. Not because a court had ruled. Not because anyone had won. Because the story Diane controlled for years had finally collided with evidence. And evidence usually wins. As I walked toward my truck, Marla caught up with me. "You realize what's happening now?" I nodded. "The investigation." She shook her head. "Something bigger." I waited. "The county is looking at access rights." "Okay." "The residents are looking at assessments." "Okay." She smiled slightly. "But lenders, insurers, and regulators are about to start looking at everything." I looked back toward Silver Pines in the distance. For the first time, Diane Whitmore wasn't fighting a ranch owner anymore. She was fighting the consequences of her own paperwork, and those consequences were moving faster than she could stop them. The first cracks appeared within days of the hearing. 2 mortgage lenders suspended pending home sales inside Silver Pines. Not permanently, just until the county completed its review. That was enough. Real estate agents started making phone calls. Homeowners started asking questions. And insurance companies began requesting updated infrastructure documentation. The county investigation moved quickly, much faster than Diane expected. Russell's file led investigators to additional records. Those records led to more questions. And those questions led to financial audits. Every week seemed to uncover something new. Expired permits, incorrect parcel references, infrastructure approvals tied to temporary access agreements. Nothing dramatic by itself. Together, it painted a picture nobody could ignore. Silver Pines had been operating on assumptions for years. The biggest blow came when investigators confirmed the timeline. The HOA had discussed unresolved easement concerns internally months before, issuing the largest round of infrastructure assessments. That detail changed everything. Mistakes happen. People forgive mistakes. Collecting money while knowing there may be a problem is different. Homeowners understood that immediately. Diane Whitmore resigned 3 weeks before Christmas. No public statement, no explanation. Just a short email to residents announcing her departure. After years of acting like the most powerful person around Mercer Lake, she disappeared almost overnight. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The woman who loved public announcements left without making one. The HOA board didn't survive much longer. Several members stepped down. Others refused re-election. County officials eventually placed Silver Pines under temporary administrative oversight, while attorneys negotiated solutions. That part took months, and honestly, it wasn't exciting. No dramatic courtroom speeches, no surprise arrests, no television cameras, just survey maps, meetings, engineers, lawyers, and stacks of paperwork, exactly the way most real property disputes are resolved. Marla Bennett handled the negotiations. Her goal was simple: protect the homeowners, protect Mercer Ranch, fix the problem properly. Despite everything that happened, I never wanted families to lose their homes. Most of them weren't responsible for the mess. People like Frank Tillman and Melissa Carter bought houses believing professionals had done their jobs. They trusted the paperwork they were given, the same way most people would. Eventually, agreements were reached. Real agreements, recorded correctly, reviewed correctly, permanent easements for emergency access, permanent utility corridors, proper maintenance rights, clearly defined boundaries, no assumptions, no vague language, no invented authority, just legal documents saying exactly what belonged to whom. The illegal shoreline fence came down shortly afterward. So did the signs claiming community ownership over my property. The marina plans were redesigned. The access routes were updated. For the first time in years, the maps finally matched reality. By spring, Mercer Lake felt different. Not because the water changed, because the noise was gone. No more threats. No more assessment notices. No more arguments about who controlled what. One cold morning, I was replacing a weathered board on the dock when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around. Melissa Carter stood there with her son. The boy couldn't have been older than 8. He held a fishing rod almost as tall as he was. For a moment, he just stared at the lake, then at me, then back at the lake. Finally, he asked the question, "Mr. Mercer?" "Yeah?" "My mom says this is your dock." "It is." He hesitated, then looked down at the fishing rod. "Are we allowed to fish here?" The question hit harder than he probably realized. Allowed. For months, people had argued about authority, control, ownership, permissions. And here was a kid simply wanting to fish. I looked across Mercer Lake. The water was calm. The same shoreline my father had protected. The same shoreline Silver Pines tried to claim. The same shoreline that nearly became the center of a legal disaster. Then I smiled. "Sure." The boy's face lit up immediately. "Really? Long as you respect the water." He nodded so fast it made me laugh. A few minutes later, he was standing at the edge of the dock trying to cast while Melissa watched from behind. Before leaving, she handed me a cup of coffee. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For not trying to destroy the neighborhood." I looked out across the lake again, then shook my head. This was never about destroying anything. She waited. My father taught me something a long time ago. What? Ownership isn't about controlling people. The words came easier than I expected. It's about responsibility, knowing where your rights end and someone else's begin. Melissa nodded, because she understood. Most people finally did. After she left, I sat alone on the dock for a while. The same dock my father built decades earlier. The same dock where Claire and I used to drink coffee before sunrise. The same dock people once claimed belonged to the community. The lake was quiet, just water against cedar boards. Nothing more. And that's when I realized my father had been right all along. The note he left in that old filing cabinet wasn't really about developers, or access agreements, or easements. It was about memory. Because land remembers. It remembers who cared for it, who respected it, who tried to take shortcuts, and who took the time to get things right. Diane Whitmore spent years believing confidence could replace ownership. The records proved otherwise. In the end, no speech defeated her. No threat defeated her. No act of revenge defeated her. The truth did. And around Mercer Lake, the truth was finally recorded exactly where it belonged.
If there's one lesson I take from this whole experience, it's that patience matters more than pride when you're protecting something important. There are plenty of moments when I could react out of frustration. Plenty of times I could argue louder, push harder, or try to force the issue. But none of that would solve the real problem. What made the difference was taking time to understand the facts, keep good records, and let the truth speak for itself. That's not always the fastest part, but in the long run, it's usually the strongest one. I think that applies to more than land dispute. Whether it's a piece of property, a family legacy, or simply your good name, something are worth defending with steady hands and a clear head. Strength isn't always about pushing forward. Sometimes it's about standing firm and refusing to let confusion replace the truth. I'd love to hear from you. How do you ever deal with an HOA, a property dispute, or a situation where paperwork ends up telling a very different story than people did? If you have, drop a yes in these comments and share your experience. I read more of those stories than you might think. And if you enjoy this story about perseverance, common sense, and people standing there for the right way, consider subscribing to the channel. We've got plenty more stories from branch country, small towns, and lakeside communities still ahead. Until next time, take care of yourself and take care of each other.